Well, welcome everybody to Downtown Harbor Church. If it is your first time here, my name is John. I am the lead pastor. Appreciate you guys coming on out. So today, as Adam said, we are kicking off a brand new series. We're calling it Breaking the Cycle. And over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be taking a look at attitudes, behaviors, mindsets, however you kind of want to describe these things that we all get sucked into. And we're going to talk about the negative impact they can have on our lives and our spiritual lives. And then, most importantly, we're going to find out what God has to say about breaking the cycle and starting fresh. So, to kick off today, I want to talk about a behavior, as Adam said, that I think is going to hit close to home for many of us. I want to talk about complaining. Now, on Monday night at dinner, I was telling my wife that I was going to be preaching about complaining. And the very first words out of her mouth. Okay, like I didn't even finish saying the word complaining, and the very first things she said to me are you taking notes for yourself?" Okay, and I was like, "Yes, in fact, thank you very much. I'm going to be acknowledging publicly that this is an issue for me." She goes, "Good, good, because when you walk around saying you're tired 20 times a day, that's complaining." To which I go, "That's just a statement of fact." And she goes, "No, it's complaining." Okay, agree to disagree. Now, with that being said, let me just be totally transparent, right? We're all friends. Here's the deal. I love to complain. It's like my favorite thing to do. And now, truth be told, when I complain, it really is more of a bit. It's like shtick, but I do complain quite a bit. And when you're from New Jersey, as I am, complaining really is kind of a pastime. It's just what we do up there, okay? We kvetch, to use a Yiddish term. And so this week in preparation for this topic, I was trying to think about some stuff that I regularly complain about, and I wrote them down, okay? And I'm gonna call them Agrippa's grievances. Now, here's the deal with this list. I only wrote down 3. You know, John in the Bible says that if he wrote down all of Jesus' miracles, the world wouldn't be big enough to contain all the books. Same goes for my complaints. So I'm just going to give you 3, and maybe you can relate to them. Now, this first one is an obvious one. Slow drivers, okay? Big surprise here. Bane of my existence, especially on Bayview Drive. And slow drivers are really a double whammy of sin for me because not only do they cause me anger and rage and to think murderous thoughts and to want to plow my car into the nearest telephone pole, I will then complain about it for the rest of the day. Number 2. Agrippa's grievances, slow refills. If I'm going out to eat, okay, I don't want to have to ration my water like I'm on a desert island. All right? I want that cup filled up like every 2 minutes. You know when there's like so much ice at that point, they got to keep, okay? That's what I want. Now, if they don't do that, I won't say anything. I never complain at a restaurant. Never. I'm not going to complain to the manager. I'm not going to complain to the server. I will, however, complain endlessly to the people at my table. Number 3, I'll ruin your meal. I don't care. We're on the topic of refills. Last one, no free refills. Okay. Allow me to put Houston's restaurant on blast for just one moment. I will not go to that restaurant for one reason and one reason only. They charge for refills. Unacceptable. Un-American. If I order a Diet Coke, listen, I want to bathe in Diet Coke. I want to dump it on the ground if I so choose, okay? Don't charge me for, okay, that's just a small sampling of my woes. I could be here all day. Getting fired up. Let's talk about you. What do you complain about? Your job? Your commute? Your spouse? Your lack of a spouse? You know what I find interesting is that our complaints kind of shift over the course of our life. You know, you complain about not being married, and then you get married, and then you complain about being married. Or you complain that you don't have kids, and then you have those kids, and now you can't stop complaining about the kids that you so desperately wanted. Okay, we all complain. Everybody does it. And we just kind of say, well, you know, it's not really that big of a deal. And even I, from here, you know, excuse it. I'm going, well, it's shtick. It's a bit. The reality is, it's complaining. I am a complainer, and maybe you are too. Now, the good news, bad news, is that Scripture is filled with complainers, so you're not alone. You go back to the beginning of the Bible. Adam, first guy ever lived, complained. When he sinned and he ate that fruit, and God called him out on it, Adam said, you know, you gave this woman to me, and she gave me the fruit from the tree, and so I ate it. In other words, Lord, it's your fault. I was doing just fine. Everything was great. I was naked and happy. Imagine that. And naming animals, and life was beautiful until you brought that woman around and she took me down. the world's first complaint. You want to look at a story of a guy who really had something to complain about? Go read the story of Job. This will really cheer you up. And you want to feel good about your life? Read this. Long story short, if you don't know this story, Job loved God. Loved God. Satan shows up, says to God, you know, the only reason Job loves you is because you bless him. And if you were to take away those blessings, he would curse you. And God's like, no, no chance. In fact, go test Job. And so the rest of the book, what you see is Satan systematically taking everything away from Job. And in chapter 10, Job says, I am disgusted with my life. This could be a life verse for some of you. Like, some people put John 3:16 under their eyes. I'm doing Job 10:1, okay? I'm disgusted with my life, he says. Let me complain freely. My bitter soul must complain. I saw another translation, it's even better. He goes, I will give free rein to my complaints. Love that. I'm not holding back. If I don't like it, I'm going to let it be known. It's like old people. One last one. If there was one group that is famous for their complaints, it would definitely be the Israelites, God's own people. If you know their story, you'll remember that for hundreds of years, the Israelites, the Hebrews, were in slavery in Egypt. And their one prayer is that God would set them free. And finally, when the time was right, God did just that. He raised up Moses as their leader. He then sent 10 plagues to force the hand of the Pharaoh. Pharaoh released them. They walked out into the desert. What did God do for them? He parted the Red Sea. He made sure their clothes never wore out. He miraculously brought them water and food every day. What did the Israelites do? They complained about the food God gave them. Talk about beggars can't be choosers. God literally, and when I say literally, I mean literally brought water out of rocks for these people. He made manna appear every single day so they wouldn't starve. And they had the audacity to complain and say, if only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Can you imagine how that made God feel? I'll talk about that in just a second. So Adam complained. Job complained. The Israelites complained. I complained. You complained. We all complained. I am convicted, especially after working on this message all week, that we need to break the cycle that we are stuck in, and we need to quit complaining. So let's talk about why. Why is complaining a problem? Because fundamentally, we know we shouldn't complain, but let's talk about why. First, complaining offends the heart of God. Here's how I think about this. If you're a parent, many of you are parents, and you were all kids at one point, so this still works. If you're a parent, you do a lot for your kids. You bless them in so many ways, and then they just complain, and they whine, and they seem ungrateful. And isn't it true that you just want to wring their little necks, okay? You're not going to, but you want to. That's how I imagine God feels when we, his children, complain. Look at what happens in Numbers 11, verse 1. It says this. When the people complained, yeah, let me pause. This particular translation puts it pretty lightly. Other translations say when they, meaning the Israelites, complained bitterly about their circumstances. That even though God had answered their prayer, even though God had rescued them from slavery, even though God kept them safe in that desert, and even though he provided them food and water, they complained bitterly and it displeased the Lord. It offended him. And when the Lord heard it, his anger burned. That's not a good thing, okay? So what happened? Because when the Lord heard it, his anger burned. And so the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outer part of the camp. God had to nip that behavior in the bud, and he scorched their camp, right? He put them in a timeout, right? Complaining offends the heart of God. Second thing we see, complaining actually carries significant consequences. And we're going to get into the spiritual consequences in a second, but let's first talk about relational consequences of complaining. I would say this, okay? When you complain, you drive people away, all right? And I'm not talking about the occasional rant that we all go into. I'm not talking about the joke complaining that I do, although I'm sure that gets annoying after a while. I'm talking about real complainers. I'm talking about your mother-in-law. Not mine. Mine's fine. I'm talking about yours. Right? I'm talking about Sue from accounting. These people who just exude negativity. Everything's a problem. They got a problem with their kids. They got a problem with their neighbors. They got a problem with their church and their doctors and their weather. It is exhausting being in their presence. And you can't wait to get away from them. In fact, when you find out that they're going to be somewhere that you got to go, you dread going because you know what you're in for. They're the kind of people that when their name pops up on your caller ID, it's like, because you know they're going to suck the life out of you. When you complain, you drive people away. That's a relational consequence. Let's talk about the spiritual consequences of complaining. Here's what God had to say about those complaining Israelites we were talking about. He says, how long must I put up with this wicked community and its complaints about me? Yes, I've heard the complaints the Israelites are making against me. So God, in this moment, is actually talking to Moses and Aaron. And he's like, ooh, boys, I'm about to lose it with these people. I've had it up to here. I've done everything they asked, and they don't stop complaining. Now tell them this. Growing up, when my dad, he would have this whistle that he would do, just like that, all right? And when I heard that whistle, I knew I messed up. And I knew he was about to lay the hammer down. That's God right here. He's about to lay the hammer down. And he's like, I have heard their complaints. I have heard their grumblings. Oh, we wish we were dead. Oh, the food stinks, yada, yada, yada. So God says, now tell them this. As surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. In other words, careful what you wish for. It's like when Kevin McAllister in Home Alone said, I hope I never have to see any of you jerks again. And you know how that turned out for him. So God then rattles off all their complaints, and he metes out justice. And then he wraps up by saying something very interesting. And he gives them the consequences of their complaining. And he says, not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home. In other words, the very thing you wanted, you're not going to get. You've complained so much, you're so ungrateful that I will not bless you with what I wanted to bless you with. In other words, God's saying, I just can't reward that behavior. Because your attitude, because you're complaining hard, I cannot give you what you wanted most of all. And we got to be careful when we try to pull principles out of the Old Testament, because sometimes God is doing something unique and special and particular with the Israelites, all right? So it might not be a universal principle. So I'm not going to tell you that God's going to do this to you. However, it would be imprudent, shall we say, unwise for us to just close our eyes to this, stick our heads in the sand. And I think it's fair to embrace the idea that complaining may cause us to miss out on God's blessings. And again, I'm not saying this is a hard and fast rule. I'm just saying based on what we see here, there's a chance that God may not do what he wanted to do in your life because you're complaining. I mean, parents, you know this. How many times have you wanted to take your kids to the park or to a restaurant or to do something nice, but because they were being a brat, you said, you know what? We're not going. Because we can't reward this kind of behavior. This is exactly what we see happening here with the Israelites. I mean, what if? And again, there's Justice friends chewing on this, talking about this. I'm just saying, what if there was something that you wanted in your life and you've been praying about? And don't miss this, it's something that God wanted to give you because of your attitude, because you've been complaining and grumbling against God. God said, no. And he withholds that blessing. So complaining may cause us to miss out on God's blessing. Secondly, I would argue, complaining prevents us from fully experiencing God's blessing. Meaning, when you're a complainer, and I can speak to you from experience, you do begin to see the world through a negative filter. And you miss out on the blessings all around you. For example, let's say you're on vacation, right? What does that mean? That means God has blessed you with a job, which has allowed you to save some money, to travel to a location, to have some fun with friends and family or whoever, right? But because your room doesn't have the best view, you allow it to ruin your whole trip. You can't get past that partial ocean view. You know what I mean? Like you paid top dollar to see the ocean, but you need like that Hubble telescope to see it. And you are so burned up. And you're sitting on that beautiful beach, but honestly, all you're thinking about is that disappointing room. And you keep harping about that room. And the kids are like, Daddy, Daddy, come swim with us. And you go swimming, but mentally, you're not even there because you're so mad about that room. And you're driving everybody crazy about that room. And your complaining has caused you to miss out on the blessings that God had in store for you on that trip. You know where else I see complaining cause us to miss out and not fully experience God's blessings? The local church. Now, let me say this before I go into my diatribe here. I have never worked, and this is a good thing I'm about to say, I've never worked at a church like DHC before. I've never served at or worshiped alongside people who are so grateful and charitable. And over the last 10 years, I can count literally on one hand the number of complaints that we have received. And I just got to say, I think that makes God smile. Now, does that mean we get everything right? Absolutely not. Okay, trust me. We are a work in progress, but you all come to church with a grateful heart. You know what God has done in your life. You know what God can do in your life. And so you come here with a grateful heart to worship Him and to grow. And because of that, you fully experience everything God has to offer on a Sunday morning. Unfortunately, that is not the norm in many churches. Because what I've seen in my past, and maybe you've seen this as well, is that many Christians, they don't come to church with an open and grateful heart. Rather, many Christians come to church with a list of complaints. Sermon's too long, sermon's not long enough. Sermon's too deep, sermon's too shallow. Music's too loud, music's not loud enough. We need more hymns, we need more modern music. Greeters didn't say hi to me, greeters were too friendly. Pastor shouldn't wear jeans, pastor shouldn't wear a suit. Oh my gosh. And because they come to church filled with complaints, rather than filled with gratitude, they miss out on the blessings that God had in store for them on a Sunday morning. Listen, if you're a Christian, and many of you are, let me remind you of something. Jesus died for you. We are here today, literally at 11:08. We are here today because of Him. We are here today to worship Him. This is all about Him. But when you complain, you make it all about you. Your complaining has caused you to take an experience that is supposed to be all about God and worshiping God and giving Him thanks and giving Him praise, and you made it about you. Now I'm talking about church right now, but this truth extends to all areas of your life and all relationships in your life. When you complain about whatever, okay, it's because you think you're the main character. It's your world. We're just living in it. Sociologists have been studying this recently, and they have found something very interesting. They have found that there is a positive correlation between blessings and complaining. And what they have found through their research is the more blessed people are, the more critical they become. Now, you'd think it'd be the opposite, wouldn't you? The more blessed we are, they found, the more advantages that we have, the more entitled we become. And they have found that anytime we don't get what we want, anytime something isn't the way that we think it should be, we have the right to complain. Why? Well, because we're the main character. And life's all about us. And it is having disastrous effects on our mental health, on our relationships, and in our spiritual life. How do we break the cycle? Because if sociologists are correct, and the more blessed we are, the more apt we are to complain, then we're in a bit of a tight spot. Because as Americans, we're blessed. And if you're a Christian and you're American, you are doubly blessed. So what do we do? How do we go about restraining the complaining? First thing we got to do is we got to change how we speak. If our words are the problem, then we got to change our words. And Paul doesn't mince his words. He just comes right out and says it. He says, do everything without complaining and arguing. In other words, don't complain. This is one of those verses that you want to memorize and quote to your kids. Take out the trash. Philippians 2:14, go do it. Paul said it. I'm going to challenge you, however, to apply this to all of your relationships. If you're married, and you're struggling in your marriage, here's what I know. I know there's a lot of complaining and arguing, isn't there? Why? Because, and you're never going to admit this, it's because you think you're the main character. You think you're the center of that relationship. And if anything doesn't live up to your expectations, you feel you have the right to complain about it. Now, I don't do a lot of marriage counseling, but when I do, generally, both parties come with a list of complaints. He does this, she does that. And to be honest, as a third party listener, it's all petty stuff. I mean, it is. But petty stuff is a problem. Petty stuff builds and drives people towards divorce. And so what I always do is I always pause the conversation. And I say, at one point, you liked each other. That always stops them dead in their tracks because I'm right. At one point, you loved each other. You loved each other. Couldn't wait to be with each other. That's why you got married. And then I had them list all the things that they love about the other person. And guess what? Soon that list is way longer than their list of complaints. The complaining caused them to lose sight of their love. Do everything, Paul says, without complaining and arguing. He continues. He says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth. In other words, when you're about to complain, just bite your tongue. Anytime you feel that impulse to air a grievance, just don't. I've been doing this all morning. I literally have nothing to say anymore. I'm just like walking around in silence. It's just a bummer. I gotta be honest with you. Anyway, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. In other words, instead of riding your kids constantly, look for ways to encourage them and build them up. Instead of just complaining about some problem at your workplace, be the solution. Because when you complain, you just tear things down and tear people down. And Paul's like, that is not how God called you to live. He wants you to make things better. Complaining is easy. That's why everybody does it. Building something better is hard work, but it is such a blessing for all those involved. So we got to change how we speak. We got to watch our mouths. We got to bite our tongues. We want to build others up and build situations up, not just tear them down. Lastly, and this is a big one, we got to change how we think, okay? We need to change our perspective on a situation because life is not always going to be great. Jesus says, in this life, you will have trouble. So there are going to be times when we find ourselves in situations that we don't like, that are hard, that are painful, that are super annoying, that we wish we could change, but sometimes we just can't. And we're going to be tempted to complain, but instead of complaining, Paul is going to tell us that we need to choose to rejoice. This right here is a complete shift in how we think. He's going to challenge us to look at our circumstances from a completely different perspective. And ultimately, he's going to challenge us to get our eyes off of ourselves and onto God. And when we do, we will see an opportunity to rejoice where others only see an opportunity to complain. Now, before I tell you what Paul says, I want to talk to you about where he says it from, and that is prison. Okay? This is important. Paul, if you don't know, gave his entire life to serving Jesus, the last 30 years or so to serving Jesus. Gave everything up to travel around the Mediterranean world, starting churches and spreading the gospel. And in his service to Jesus, Paul notes that he had been flogged 5 times. 3 times he was beaten with rods. Once he was stoned. 3 times he had been shipwrecked. Once bitten by a poisonous snake. And now, to top it all off, the coup de grace, he's now locked in prison, chained to a Roman guard 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with the threat of death looming over his head for just preaching the gospel. If anybody had a right to complain, it would be Paul. But look at what he says, realizing that he's kind of at the end of his life. But I will rejoice, even if I lose my life, pouring it out like a liquid offering to God. Now, this is a little bit of a clunky translation. I tried to find the best one that I could. But Paul is saying, even if I die for this, even if I die in my service to Jesus Christ, I am going to rejoice. how could he say something like this? How could he look at his circumstances that were so bad? I mean, so bad, that to be honest, weren't fair. I mean, if I were locked in prison for preaching the gospel, I'd be like, God, come on, cut me slack. I'm doing your work. Yet he's rejoicing. How could he say this? I'll tell you how. Because he is the same guy who wrote, I have been crucified with Christ, and I myself no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Look at this. And the real life I now have with this body is a result of my trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. You know what this means? You know what he's saying here? Because what he's saying here is going to completely change your perspective on your life. Paul is saying, I am no longer the main character. Jesus is. What did sociologists discover about our complaints? We think we are the main character. We think our life is all about us. And whenever something happens that we don't like or inconveniences us, or we don't think is fair, or we would do it differently, we complain. Because we're viewing this world and our life as though we are the center of the story, but Jesus is the center of the story. Paul can be locked away in jail, facing death, and yet he can rejoice because he changed how he thinks. He changed his perspective. And even though he is in the midst of a terrible situation, he realizes God is at work. That even now, as he's chained to a guard, awaiting possible execution, he can rejoice. Because he knows that ultimately God has a plan. And God has a purpose. And God can use his discomfort for his glory and Paul's future good. So Paul would say, how could I possibly complain? My question to you is, what would it look like for you to change your perspective? I'll tell you what it looked like for me. You know, I speak openly about my anxiety. We were just talking about it earlier in the hallway. I'm a diagnosed hypochondriac, okay? And at times, I have allowed it to absolutely ruin my life. I'd give anything, honestly, to not have this type of anxiety. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. It's not fun. And over the course of my life, I have complained unendingly about it. I have pleaded with God to remove it, and he has not. But I'll tell you what God did do. God changed my perspective. And after years of complaints and prayer, God finally allowed me to realize that which I complain about could be something I could rejoice about. And he helped me realize that my anxiety could be one of my greatest ministry tools. That because of this thorn in my side, to quote Paul, I now have the gift of sympathy for those who struggle with mental health. Because of this anxiety, I now have the gift of empathy for those who suffer. Because of this anxiety, I now have the ability to use the wisdom that I have gained to help others who are struggling. And because of this anxiety, it enables me to serve God and glorify him in a way that I never would have been able to were it not for this thing that I would love to complain about. In my anxiety, I can rejoice and thank God for what he's doing in this difficult area of my life. So what about you? What would it look for you to take your eyes off yourself and off your problem and off your circumstances and off this situation that you wish you could change, but maybe you can't, and put them onto God? To choose, because it's a choice, to choose to see God's presence and power in the middle of something that you never asked for. What would it look like to faithfully cling to God's promise, Romans 8:28, that he is working everything together, even this, what you're going through right now, for your future good, rather than just complaining about it? I'm telling you, if you can get your eyes off yourself onto God, you will see an opportunity to rejoice where others only see an opportunity to complain. And you will be set free from your circumstances. And you will break that cycle. So what's the practical? What do you do with a message like this? If it's your first time here at Downtown Harbor Church, every single week we put this word onto the screen because we want to make sure you can leave on a Sunday and know exactly what to do with what you've heard. So today really was one long practical, so I'm going to keep this short and sweet. If complaining is a problem for you, I would first challenge you to find an accountability partner, okay? Maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a best friend or a sibling or a parent, somebody that you can ask to call you out whenever they catch you complaining. Now, the reason this is so important in my mind is that sometimes we don't even realize when we're complaining. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite all of you to be my accountability partner. And if you hear me complaining, feel free to call me out. Now, here's the thing. I've been doing this for a long time. So I can't necessarily quit cold turkey. I'm going to need a couple complaints here and there, you know what I mean? Otherwise, I'm going to go into withdrawal. So work with me here in this process as I try to break this cycle. Secondly, I would challenge you guys to ask God to change your perspective. What does this look like? I think it's going to the Lord and say, Lord, you know what I'm dealing with. And you know how I've reacted in the past, but I want to change. Help me to see you in this. Help me to see this situation, whatever it is, from a different angle, a different perspective. Change me, please, in the midst of this difficulty so that when I come out the other side, I'm better for it. And I will give you all the glory. Let me pray for you.